Hey everybody, this is Patrick Amar, tour guide and resident of Israel. I'm in this town of Modi'in. I know people are concerned everywhere about Israel and doing all they can to help. And I just wanted to also do what I can do to help. And I'm just making here with a friend and colleague, Elliot Chodoff. Elliot is in northern Israel right now. He is a political military analyst specializing in the Middle East conflict and the global war of terrorism. His articles have appeared in the Washington Times, National Post, and numerous web journals. Elliot is a major in the IDF Reserves and is a graduate of the Homefront Command Senior Commander's Course. He has served in Gaza. He has served in Lebanon. He has served throughout his illustrious career. So I just wanted to bring him on here and just talk about Gaza, the situation in Israel right now, how we got here, what's happening, and where we're headed. Elliot, thanks you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit, because history didn't start a year ago or 15
No.
years ago. Maybe just give us a little rundown of Gaza specifically, and just like the microcosm of the situation there. What's the last 50 years of how Israel's dealt with the Gaza situation, and any information in like short bursts for our listeners.
Okay, so let's go back further than 50 years. At the end of Israel's War of Independence, 48-49, Egypt had control of Gaza, and terrorism out of Gaza began in the early 1950s. In other words, I think it's really important here to understand terrorism out of Gaza is not a post-1967 Israeli capture of Gaza event. It goes back to the early 50s. It was ultimately stopped in 1956 by Israel's attack on Egypt and taking of Sinai, and that sort of settled things down there for a while. We took Gaza as part of the Six-Day War of 1967, and then again, Gaza became a center of terrorism almost immediately. The first major acts of terrorism out of Gaza started in 68, 69. There was a major Israeli operation under Ariel Sharon in 1970 that put that down. But frankly, Gaza has been a problem since the very, very beginning of the state. I don't want to go back earlier than that because there's a history there as well, but good enough to start from 1948. It is a center of refugee camps, but more importantly, it is a center of the Muslim Brotherhood from which Hamas is generated. So it didn't start yesterday. It didn't start 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years ago. It started way, way earlier than that, and it's always been problematic.
What people will say, this might be a little bit outside your wheelhouse, but what people will say is that terrorism from Gaza is a reaction to the Israeli occupation.
Right, but that doesn't explain why it started in the early 1950s, unless you consider the Israeli occupation the existence of Israel. I'm not going there. I don't discuss that.
Well, which many people do, which many people do, especially in the Arab world and Muslim world.
For sure, and in the West. And I'm not willing to discuss my existence with anybody.
Okay, fair enough. Also, what about the location of Gaza specifically? I remember going there to that area with you, and you just really opened up my mind by describing it not as a very strategic, important location. Can you speak about that?
Okay, so Gaza is along the coast, south of Tel Aviv, Ashdod, Ashkelon, not far from Ashkelon is right next to Gaza. It's a strip a few kilometers wide by, let's say, about 5 miles wide, 8 miles wide, depending on where, by about 35 miles long.
That's small.
Yeah.
One of the most densely populated areas.
Okay, so yes and no. It has some very densely populated pockets. There are 3 major cities in Gaza: Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and Rafiah, a number of towns and villages. Within Gaza City, there is a refugee camp called Jabalia that is extremely densely packed. But if anybody's been watching the news over the past few days, you can also see there are wide open areas in Gaza. In other words, this idea that it is a packed, and I've seen the analogy, Warsaw Ghetto kind of a situation, where the Nazis packed 500,000 Jews into an area that normally had a population of 50,000, is simply false.
What about its location along that coastal plain and between Israel and Egypt and between bigger picture Asia and Africa?
Okay, so as I said, it's along the coastal plain. The main road from Israel, actually from further north from Israel, but the main road to Egypt runs through Gaza and then along the northern Sinai coast. But again, since it's a narrow strip, it really doesn't affect Israel's contact with Egypt. We have a very long border with Egypt starting below the Gaza Strip. But the fact is that Gaza, while most of its land border is with Israel, it does have a land border with Egypt as well.
Well, it's true that we have a long border with Egypt, but most of that border is rugged, mountainous, desert terrain, whereas the
Yes,
terrain in Gaza is like the coastal road.
correct.
So
As
it
I
is
said,
like a
that
choke. It is a choking point.
it is on a grand strategic level, but there are roads south of Gaza that go into Egypt. Remember, into Egypt, we're talking about into Sinai. It's not as if on the other side of Gaza is Cairo. Cairo is 200 miles away.
Right. So what about Egypt in all of this? I mean, I know Egypt is everybody asks about Egypt. What can you say about Egypt's role in this?
Look, first of all, we're at peace with Egypt. Egypt is suffering from its own terrorist issues in Sinai. It certainly doesn't need another headache because it is adjacent. And I mean, we gave the Gazan population the advice a couple of days ago publicly to flee into Egypt. I'm sure the Egyptians are not happy with that. So you can have a sort of strategic alliance and peace relations and still not agree on or not have common interests necessarily on every specific point. The Egyptians would certainly like to see Gaza quiet. And as I said before, Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is nothing but trouble for the Egyptian government as well. So I would say that on the one hand, they're looking at it with a certain amount of satisfaction, seeing Hamas getting beaten up right now. On the other hand, they're hoping that we're not kicking the hornet's nest.
Just going back to the history a little bit, the last, let's say, 50 years. So from 1967, Israel captures Gaza until, let's say, 1987 with the first Intifada, which kind of ushers in this desire to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and, maybe usher in the Oslo agreements in the 1990s. And then the breakdown of the Oslo agreements by the end of the 90s and early 2000s, and then Israel's withdrawal or disengagement from Gaza and basically putting a wall around the place. And I just remember going there with you again and speaking about that. Maybe you can speak about Israel's tactics of containment or whatever you desire to call it.
Okay, so the Intifada, and I don't call it the first, it was the only Intifada as far as I'm concerned, that broke out at the end of 87, really. We should mark it as it was December, so from 1988. It was during that period that Hamas was formed, and they began attacks already during that period. The end of the Intifada was essentially the Oslo Agreement of the early 1990s. And the first Oslo Agreement, was based on what was known as Gaza Jericho First. We were going to withdraw from the Palestinian areas of Gaza, which was about 90% of the territory. Don't hold me to that round number. And Jericho. Jericho was because it was the most urban, middle-class business town in the West Bank.
And in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea, kind of like in the middle of nowhere.
Out in the middle of nowhere. And the idea was, let's see what they can do there. And the withdrawal from Gaza was basically a realization and recognition already in the early 90s that we were not controlling it. In other words, our army was in there, we were patrolling, it was a disaster. And the guys who were patrolling were sitting ducks, we were losing men, and we knew we simply were not controlling it. So we pulled out of the Palestinian populated areas, which I said was about 90% of the territory. Don't hold me to the exact number, and remained with Jewish residential localities, primarily Gush Katif, and three towns along the northern border of the Strip. In other words, near on the Ashdod side of the Strip, adjacent to the border, and three isolated towns, Netzarim, Kfar Darom, and the third one escapes me at the moment. But in any event, over the years, through the 90s, and then the outbreak of what I call the terrorist war, which is commonly referred to as the Second Intifada in 2000, the terrorist attacks against Israel in general went up significantly. And we were faced with a military dilemma. And here I have to say, in 2002, I was in Gaza. I was called down there by the divisional commander as an advisor and a consultant to rebuild their defensive strategy, which I didn't do alone, but I was part of. And when we finished, I turned to him and I said, it's not going to work. And he said, of course not. You can't defend this place. We were committing close to 30% of the IDF's infantry capability to defending the Jewish population of Gaza, which was about 10,000 people. Okay. Now, you don't need to be Napoleon to figure out that it doesn't work. So the decision was made to pull the army out. In other words, what's called the disengagement starts with a military decision that we cannot commit 3 full brigades to protecting Gaza from the inside. And with the decision to pull out the military comes the decision to pull out the population because we're not going to leave them there unprotected. And then politics get in. I don't want to go into it because it becomes much more complex than that. But the point I think that's important to make here is that we didn't give up control of Gaza in 2005. We gave it up in 1994. And 2005 was a consequence of that, an inevitable consequence as far as I'm concerned. And the idea was then to pull back to the old ceasefire lines from 1949. In other words, what are currently referred to as the pre-67 borders misnomer, and defend from there. And essentially what has happened from 2005 until today is that for a whole bunch of reasons, the Israeli military has not kept up with reality. In other words, it has fallen behind. It's fallen into doctrines, and you heard me say this a long time ago, I think. Building fences. The idea was we're going to build a fence, and then a better fence, and a bigger fence, and a more secure fence, and a smarter fence. We invested over $1 billion in it, and this brilliant fence was going to do it all. And what I know from personal experience as well as from history is that when you build physical obstacles, it has a uniform effect historically. It makes the people sitting behind it stupid, and it makes the people sitting on the other side of it innovative. And we saw that on Saturday morning, I'm sorry to say.
Right. How could they breach that fence and wall? I mean, we've been there. I've seen it. I've been there with people, and I as a speaker, as a tour guide, I've stood there and seen it. How could they just
blow through
through that fence? It's not a fair question to ask already. We're only like 4 or 5 days into this, but really, we need to ask this question. Everybody's asking the question.
It's a fence. It's a fence. And what happens is that once the barrier goes up, and then it gets backed up with a sophisticated automatic firing system called Roe Yore, it sees and it fires. Well, how much more secure can you be than that? So they take out the super sophisticated fire system with a bunch of drones that you or I could buy on AliExpress for a few bucks a piece, and they drop essentially hand grenades. I'm exaggerating a bit, from these drones into the sensor and communication system of these super sophisticated systems and knock them out.
Yeah, you make it sound so, yeah.
And now what? You know what? You have more computing power in your cell phone than the US had in the early 1950s in the entire country.
Yeah.
What happens if I spray water onto it? Right? All this brilliant high technology goes zap in no time. And we all know this. I mean, people drop their phones into sinks and water and whatever, and that's it. It's dead. So on the one hand, you have this super capability, but it's also extremely fragile. And in warfare, fragile is not a good thing.
Are we at war? Not just now, but have we been at war? I speak about this that the Israeli perspective is more of a policing kind of situation than a war situation. Because in a war, you're trying to kill as many of the other side. In a policing situation, you're trying to bring people to justice.
Right.
So we don't
Well,
really, Israel doesn't really see ourselves in a war. We see us more like justice. So
yes,
have we been at war and have we been dealing with
yes.
it not as a war? Is that the reality shift we need?
Look, this is a very common misconception and misperception by Western democracies fighting terrorists. We are at war. I'll give you another example of it. Right after 9/11, I actually wrote a short article on this. Uh, President Bush at the time got up and said, "We're going to bring the perpetrators to justice." And the article I wrote was, "No, you don't want justice. You want a just war. That's what you're in. Justice means tracking them down and bringing them to trial. No. Now, the minute you think justice and the minute you think policing, and Patrick, you're absolutely correct. You think minimum violence. I don't need to use that much. Now, the truth is, in warfare, you can use controlled violence. It doesn't have to be minimum, but it doesn't have to be uncontrolled, to the nth degree, but not limited to the sense of I'm going to use the minimum, because that puts you into a mindset. And again, we saw this on Saturday morning. It puts you into a mindset of, I just don't need that much force. There were apparently, and I say this apparently because I haven't gotten all the reports in yet, there were apparently 2 Israeli tanks operating on the Gaza border Saturday morning. 2. And that border is supposed to be held by 2 brigades of troops. That's, let's say for our purposes, 5,000 men and women. A brigade of tanks is 90 tanks. Now, these were infantry brigades, but they were backed up by tank forces. A tank company is 10 tanks. 2 tanks isn't even a tank platoon. And there were tanks there. We saw Hamas dancing on them, but there were no crews. They were parked. Well, you know what? A frontline outpost is not a parking lot for tanks. But it gives you an idea of a mindset.
Yeah. Maybe I don't want to, I mean, we could talk forever, but I know you're up in northern Israel right now. Tell us a little bit
Yes.
where you are and maybe because a lot of people are also concerned about the threat from the north, especially from Lebanon
Right.
and Hezbollah.
Right. So we had a good scare yesterday that turned out to be a false alarm. There were sirens and somebody misread something and thought that either drones or hang gliders or I don't know, the Millennium Falcon, whatever was coming in from Lebanon. But look, Hezbollah is up there. They're pushing. They're irritating. I don't believe that they will go in, but notice I say that very, very hesitantly. I do think that the American response over the past few days has been very helpful, and I don't want to get into American politics, but policy. I think that Biden was very clear in his speech, and he followed it up. People criticized the speech for not mentioning Iran explicitly, although I think he made it very clear who he was talking about. But then he did add in another statement later, and he said Iran explicitly. The sending of an American carrier task force is certainly major. They've also either put on alert or sent, it's not clear, special forces, perhaps to help with hostage rescue. The special forces thing is interesting, maybe helpful, symbolic. The carrier task force is critical. It's putting everybody on notice that America is moving strategic assets here, and putting them in harm's way for American interests. Let's be clear. It's not
for global interests. Absolutely.
For sure. Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it helps us and it's good for us, and it's done in assistance, so to speak. But it's certainly in America's interest and not against America's interests. So if I had to bet, I would bet that Iran and Hezbollah got the message, but I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it. It's way too volatile. But I don't think we're going to see Hezbollah doing anything of the style of 2006, where they're going to do something that pushes us over the edge. If they do something, it will be massive, which is also why even when the sirens were going off yesterday, I had my doubts. I don't see them sending a half a dozen guys in hang gliders into Israel. It's
No. But
in other
that's
words,
not what
it's
we're
too
afraid of. We're afraid of the rocket cache that they have, the tens of
well.
thousands or hundreds of thousands of missiles that they apparently have in Lebanon.
Okay, so first of all, they have at least 250, if not 350,000 rockets. My estimate is on the higher end. But they also have very, very well trained combat troops, the Rejwan unit, that is far superior to what we saw from Hamas on Saturday. And by the way, let's be very clear about something about what happened on Saturday. Hamas is very good at murdering and raping civilians, elderly, children, babies. But essentially, within 24 hours, virtually every Hamas terrorist who came into Israel was dead.
Right.
Um,
Which is amazing. Which is
well,
amazing on Israel's part that we can deal with that kind of chaos
exactly
in 24 hours.
Exactly. In other words, I have plenty of criticism about what happened on Saturday morning, but fair is fair. There was a response.
The response here has
the
been
army
incredible.
got out there. The police got out there. They fought. They fought under some desperate circumstances. There was one case where 12 special forces guys were surrounded by something like 200 terrorists. I mean, we're talking about heroic battles of of mythical proportions. And coming back, Hezbollah has very, very well trained assault units who are trained, and their mission is to do exactly what Hamas did on Saturday morning to us in the south. But they're not going to send in 5 guys. We're talking about 300, 400, 500 at a time, maybe more than that, plus the rockets, plus anti-tank missiles. I don't believe that they're going to risk a war over a minor incident. And a minor incident in the scale that we're talking about today, and you don't measure tragedy, you measure incidents in scale, is to go into a kibbutz and kill 5 people.
You are talking like a military strategist right now, and that's kind of comforting in many ways, and that as horrible as the atrocities have been, and people are suffering everywhere and really around the world emotionally as well, and
for good reason. We suffered a massive tragedy.
No doubt.
We suffered a massive tragedy, and go ahead.
But the threat of like wide-scale Middle Eastern war is unlikely.
I would say unlikely, and again, in large part, I think because of the American response and the European, at least
also the weakness of the Arab nations around us and their armies and their capabilities, or like Jordan's not invading Egypt. So we have a solid strategic peace with those nations. Syria's army is eliminated. Lebanon is a failed state. Iran is a threat, but
it's not an Arab country. Let's keep in mind that from the outside.
What about Turkey? People talk about Turkey.
Turkey is a very interesting case. Turkey historically and literally has one foot in the Middle East and one foot in Europe. And okay, Erdogan is Muslim Brotherhood. He's an Islamist, but on the other hand, he's a member of NATO. So I'm not surprised that he's saying all sorts of different things to different people. But I don't see him, other than rhetoric, doing very much. And he, along with Qatar and Iran and all of our other good friends out there, Russia. And by the way, this makes very clear, where the lines are drawn. Right? Russia and Iran are together. Somebody asked me the other day in an interview about Ukraine sending arms to Iran. It's like, where do you get this? Iran is supporting Russia. But it shows how much disinformation gets out there.
I feel, tell me if I'm correct or not, that Russia could be friends with the Arab nations and Iran and still not be enemies with Israel.
No, I don't agree with you. And I would say adversary rather than enemy, but Russia is certainly an adversary. Okay, now adversary is short of enemy, but they're not our friend. They're not working in any way, shape, or form for our benefit or interests.
They're not working the back channels, telling everybody to no.
On the contrary, chaos works to their benefit. I don't know if you saw Putin's remarks the other day. Basically blamed us for it all and America.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, we're still collecting bodies and they're blaming us for it.
Yeah.
I think one of the things, sometimes even massively tragic, complex situations bring out some very, very simple, clear lessons. One of them now is that the line has been very, very clearly sharpened. You're either with the Nazis or you're against the Nazis. There's none that middle ground that used to be very wide. Well, I kind of support, but I wanted this, and don't forget that. No, that's over. That's over. What we saw happen the other day makes very clear. I mean, it was clear to me all along, but it makes very clear in a graphic sense who we're dealing with. People are shocked by what happened. They forget the families over the years, and I'm talking about now decades, that were attacked by Hamas in their homes, babies shot and killed in their cribs, cars that were attacked, and terrorists going up to the car that had been wrecked and shooting a baby in the car seat. This is old news. We just saw it on a massive scale the other day. But nothing that happened this past week is qualitatively different than anything we've ever seen before.
Right. It's just the scale. Wow. Yeah. Elliot, I think we should end. I mean, like I said, we could keep talking and talking, but we really appreciate your insights. I appreciate just talking with you. And it has been actually comforting for me and to see kind of like the big picture of it all. And, hopefully life here is going to start to swing back in a direction that is good for our nation, for the Middle East, for the world. So I've never gotten so many messages from people around the world, and everybody's really reaching out and caring. So thank you so much. This is going to go out to like Facebook a little bit, and YouTube, and just for people who want more information.
Send it to me and I'll put it up on mine also.
Thank you so much.
Okay.